Welcome again for everybody for the Mole Pros webinar series. Today we have Cait Crowell. She's a practitioner who has her own website and podcast. If you didn't catch me on her podcast in July, I would recommend going to her website and searching my name, and you should be able to find the podcast that we did together. Big fan of her website, tons of information on there. She has really great guests continually rotating guests all the time. If you're not on her, following her Instagram, I would highly recommend doing that as well. Tons of good information on there, as well as good not just good medical advice, but just all kinds of different advice for lots of different things. Well, thank you, Cait, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So why don't we just at first here go over just a little bit of your history of how you started getting into medicine, and what was your background? What's your background?
Yeah. So not necessarily medicine. I'm not a doctor, can't diagnose or treat disease, but I am a nutritional therapy practitioner. And my background before that, I have my BS in global public health and minored in nutrition from George Mason University out in DC. I also spent a summer in Bangladesh working in a nutrition rehabilitation unit with women and children and looking at stunted growth, vitamin A deficiency and night blindness, zinc therapy for gastrointestinal disorders and diarrheal diseases and things like cholera and different various communicable diseases that are just rampant in that area. So I got a lot of experience just doing some case studies and things with the doctors in the hospital there. I also had some of my own digestive issues and anxiety and panic attacks growing up that I just never really found solid answers for. And that's what really kind of sent me down being very interested in the nutrition space, the functional medicine space, seeking out functional medicine doctors and practitioners, and just continuing to try to answer the big question of why to everything that I was experiencing, everything that I noticed a lot of other people were experiencing. And just wanting to get my feet wet in the field. So my passion really first started with global public health, understanding simple global life-saving solutions, and then through my own journey and experiencing nutrition, in a chronic setting for myself and for us here in the developed world, having gone to Bangladesh and seeing nutrition address, acute situations and, not just chronic issues, but communicable issues, and supporting the body from a nutritional perspective and the power that nutrition has on all sides of the spectrum, really shot me down the rabbit hole of getting more and more into holistic health, nutrition in general, and a functional approach, and just understanding how body systems are supposed to function, how they commonly dysfunction, and how to get back to optimal function. So after college, I completed my nutritional therapy practitioner certification through the Nutritional Therapy Association and worked with probably about 1 to 200 clients before I ended up going through Restorative Wellness Solutions, which is a certification program in order to understand labs, food sensitivity testing and stool testing and the whole nine. Again, not to diagnose or treat disease, but to just better understand imbalances in the body and how to troubleshoot them and get the body back into balance with a more holistic approach. So that has been my journey over the last 5 years now. I've had my business for 5 years. We've worked with over 300 one-on-one clients. We've run a lot of successful online programs. My main focus is in gut health and detoxification and digestive function. And my partner who's on my team, Lexi, she also does a lot with hormones, prenatal, postnatal pregnancy, infant nutrition. So yeah, we've got a lot of things going on.
No, that's great. No, I mean, thinking about food as a medicine, I think unfortunately it seems to be only co-opted by the functional health people, but hopefully we can start moving it more towards the traditional medicine group so that they can start understanding how food as medicine can be a very easy and not having a laundry list of like side effects that you hear. I mean,
Yeah.
it's always like funny. Like I'm watching like TV with my kids and my wife, and we like watch what he's like. We're watching like something on Hulu or something like that, and you hear like one of those commercials comes on for some drug, and
Yeah.
half the commercial is like the side effects of the drug. So it's
Yeah. Yeah. You never know what you're getting yourself into to some extent, but lots of options out there.
lots of options out there. And that's what kind of like what we always are trying to like say is like there's not we always have like what we call a toolkit, and we like to have lots of different tools in our toolkit. So I guess we should like probably like I always like to get off subject, but let's try to stay on subject. With mold and mycotoxins is kind of what we go over here. So give us a little bit of like your history. How did you like first like you said you had some like gut issues? Did that kind of like lead you down the mold pathway, or what led you down to like having like realizing that you might have mold exposures now and maybe in the past?
Yeah, so the biggest understanding of mold has been pretty recent for me over the last 6 months. The current home that we're in, we moved into about 2 years ago. And probably about a year before we moved in, my husband and I lived in a loft in Rhino, the River North District of Denver, which is downtown. The building was over 100 years old. Beautiful, very cool, very unique loft that was just quintessential downtown living of like we were just in the mix of it, like we just loved it. But the ceiling was, lots of water damage. And I remember like looking up into the corner and being like, is that black mold? Like, what is that? And my husband being like, nah, there wouldn't be black mold here in Colorado. It's so dry. Um, and while we were living there, I started having like more anxiety, more panic attacks. And then when we moved out and moved into this house, I remember thinking like, oh, okay, maybe this will be a cleaner environment. I didn't really know too much about mold at that point, but once we moved in here, all of my symptoms got progressively worse. So I ended up having a lot of neurological, behavioral, digestive, mood types of issues, as is common with a lot of mold symptoms. So I ended up having multiple panic attacks a day, lots of digestive issues. If we want to get into the nitty gritty here, I had a lot of bile acid diarrhea, lots of bile in my bowel movements. And that's when I really, as a practitioner, was like, there's really something going on here. Like the fact that my body was dumping bile was a huge red flag to me personally, because I know the body recycles bile like,
95%, yeah.
yeah, before it flushes it out. So I was like, geez, if my body is flushing bile out, like I've got to have something really toxic going on. And just the way that I was experiencing my nervous system and my limbic system and the moodiness, like I'm usually pretty relaxed, laid back, even keel, up for anything, very adventurous. And I started getting like just afraid of a lot of things, irrational fears, just on edge. Like neighbor would slam a door outside and I would jump, like just crazy, crazy stuff. And then the digestive issues and like no energy. I also definitely felt depressed for the first time in my life. I'd never dealt with depression in my life before. And I was like, just bummed and sad and like, this sucks. And like, why do I feel this way? Just really negative emotions that I just never really dealt with before. And so I was like, something's definitely going on. And so I reached out to my practitioner colleagues and was like, hey, here's all these things that I'm dealing with, like what's going on. I ran a bunch of blood work. I had all the telltale markers, but a lot of my colleagues that I first reached out to weren't familiar with mold. And so they were like, this is really weird. There's definitely a lot of stress on like the kidneys, the liver, like low cholesterol, low bile, low, like all of these things. And I was like, what the hell? Like, that's so weird. Why would this be happening? Ended up connecting with another colleague. And then a few more people were like, hey, this sounds like mycotoxin illness. This sounds like a mold illness. You should get tested for mycotoxins. And I'm like, oh my God, like what? Like, what does that even mean? It was so new to me. So in February of this year, my husband and I unexpectedly got pregnant, and then 8 weeks later lost, had a miscarriage really early on. And so it was, for me, all of these things leading up, I think the miscarriage was where I was like, whoa, something's really wrong. Like we've been healthy for a decade. We've we're not obsessive with health, but we're very intentional with, properly prepared nutrient dense whole foods. We live in Colorado, we're very active. All of my blood markers from a conventional standpoint were normal. It wasn't until I really started digging into things from a functional perspective and looking at optimal ranges that things were off. And then after the miscarriage, I was like, there's got to be something really toxic going on here. So I ended up doing the Great Plains mycotoxin urine test, and it came back through the roof on citrinin, ochratoxin A, and a handful of others. And that's when I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm really dealing with a mold issue. Like this is crazy. So I went down the rabbit hole of learning as much as I possibly could. We ended up getting our house tested, and we had reached out to a handful of other companies before we finally got connected with you guys at the Mold Pros. And so the process of figuring things out was really challenging. And I love what you guys do to just get the word out and just educate people. And now that I'm aware of kind of like, the right way, I guess you could call it, to go about things, it's just like, man, we got to get that out in front of people so that people don't have to go through this rabbit hole of trying to figure things out and understand it. And so for me, even as a practitioner, trying to understand, what's the right way to go about this? What's the process? What's the system that we should kind of be following? It was challenging to put all those things together. But after finding you guys, and working with some other colleagues of mine and getting connected with some supplement companies that are very intentional around mold, everything seemed to lock into place. But before that, we had spent a few months, when I first got the mycotoxin urine test back, I didn't know if what was going on in my body was a current exposure, if it was a previous exposure, how long mycotoxin would stay in the body. I had all these questions. So we kind of, what tipped the scales on this home that we're living in is we ended up, our landscapers came and they have to crawl through our crawl space to crawl up from like the back of our house to the front of our house to turn our sprinkler system on and off every season. So our landscaper came in and popped open the crawl space door, and I was like, hey, when you're down there, can you let me know if you see any like pipes leaking, water damage, if you see mold, like if it smells weird, like I'm just curious. And I didn't want to go into like, I just did a urine test.
Yeah.
So while he was down there and the door was open, I jumped in for a second. It's probably, our crawl space is about like 4 feet deep. So you still need to crawl around in it, but it's not too tiny. And I stood in there for a second and all of my symptoms got worse, like headache, brain fog, like dreamlike. I was like, whoa, like just got hit with this wall. And I was like, oh my God, I think whatever is making me feel like crap in this house is down here. So our landscape guy came back up and he was like, hey, your vapor barrier is like kind of ripped in some places, it looks like, and the soil is really soft on this one area in your crawl space. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. So we ended up doing like ambient air testing in the main part of the house after that. And they were like, everything's fine. It came back in normal range. And I was like, that's gotta be bullshit, because there's clearly something making me sick in here. And so then we ended up doing a plate test, the little petri dishes that you leave out in each room for an hour. And we sent those back to the lab and they did grow mold and candida and different species and things like that. And I remember thinking the same thing with the air test, with the plate test, like, okay, well, if it's growing here and it only sat out for an hour, then we've got to have like, where's the source of this? It's got to be coming from somewhere. So we then had like a traditional remediation company come in. These guys went down into our crawl space, no gear, no nothing, just went in, took some pictures, came back up, and on the spot wrote us like a 1-page, like, here's what we would do, it's going to be X amount of money. And I just remember thinking, like, I feel like this is just not it. Like, I feel like this is not going to get rid of the issue. And I had started to learn from people like Michael Rubino and Brian Carr and PJ Harlow and just some other people in the mold space online. And I was like, these guys are not, like the people that we had come to our house, I was like, this is not the proper way of remediation.
Yeah. But I mean, it's very common. I mean, every city has probably more people like that than people that like are like our company. I mean, there's people that are good like us all over the place, but it's like maybe like we're like 30% of the other mediators, unfortunately.
For sure. And yeah, I mean, maybe even less than that. And so we ran into the challenge of like, a lot of these people that we were aware of or that we could call or that were easy to find, from like a quick Google search that are like just, these generic, like we do mold, we do fire, we do water, we do whatever. I just started recognizing that they were all kind of treating everything like a construction job. And the
Yep.
way that it works, it's like you can't just go in there and rip everything up and think that it's better. Oftentimes people who are sensitive to mold will end up feeling worse after a remediation job like that. So I was concerned for myself. And so I ended up calling Dr. Jill Carnahan in Boulder. She's a mold literate functional medicine doctor. And I called her and was like, hey, we're dealing with this. Like, I know you're in Colorado, like we live in Denver. Do you have any remediation companies that you can send me that are aware of health challenges and that will like work with us on making sure that we feel healthy and safe in our home again after remediation instead of treating this like a construction job? And Mold Pros, you guys were on there. And so I reached out to you and it was like we just immediately got the ball rolling. The whole process was totally different. And we've felt extremely taken care of from start to finish. So that's kind of like the surface level nutshell version, even though it's a little bit long, of like what's been kind of going on, how we found out about it, how we got tested and everything. So yeah, happy to jump into the details on any piece of this, but it's definitely been a journey, not just with remediation, but also just like mentally and emotionally and detoxing mold
Yeah.
and all encompassing experience that's been like pretty wild. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much. So many nuggets that you like dropped there. I mean, just like let's start. I'm going to start somewhat from the beginning. So like, I mean, a lot of symptoms. So I've been doing this for about a decade now, like consulting with different practitioners with their like hard patients, and I say like some of the like what really got me into the mold part was like some of the like patients, they didn't have toxic chemicals. They did, so like we're testing like VOCs, we're testing like bacteria contaminants, we're testing like some fungal, like with mostly candida.
Yeah.
But I mean, and we're seeing like mitochondrial stress. We were seeing like their detox systems were clogged up. So like, okay, well, what's causing this? And then I was like finding through the literature microtoxins, and like, oh, this could be definitely a problematic. And so like you were like dropping like like your detox systems were kind of clogged up. I mean, microtoxins associated with bile, they're very easily just because they're both like very lipophilic. And then like the other thing that you like dropped was like your anxiety. One thing that I've like seen in the literature is that microtoxins inhibit a lot of the like the enzymes that either make or metabolize neurotransmitters.
Yeah.
So I mean, one of the big ones is called dopamine beta hydroxylase, and so inhibiting that can cause like severe anxiety. So I'm sure that what you're seeing there was just an inhibition of some of those enzymes.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
And then I mean, I just like published a article on our blog here at the Mold Pros talking about fertility, and yeah, I mean especially zearalenone, but also ochratoxin and aflatoxin. All three of those are very like problematic for getting pregnant or keeping a pregnancy. So also not shocking. Tell us a little bit about your like detox journey here. What have you been doing? Is it working? Have you retested since your initial urine test?
Yeah, so it's been about 4 months now, 4 months. Well, I guess I retested at 3 months, but 4 months since the first test. So the interesting thing, and I'm hearing this is pretty common, but I'm noticing that like some markers have increased because now my detox pathways are functioning better. And I've also noticed different species of mold showing up, which I've also heard is pretty common. You're shaking your head, so to be
no, it's things I always tell my practitioners is when like I say like 80% of the time you will see higher values on one or more of the like markers, and then like also don't be surprised if you see new things pop up, especially in the trichothecenes. the trichosacines are by far the most lipophilic of all the mycotoxins. So it takes a lot of like work to get them to pull out. So a lot of times people do the first test, it's unprovoked at all. So then following tests, we've like been doing like glutathione, we're doing binders, we're doing sauna. So you start getting the trichos out, and so you'll start seeing those in subsequent tests.
Yeah, yeah. And it's been, for me, the thing that was really interesting was when I first started dealing with mold symptoms, a lot of it was like emotional, neurological, sleep, insomnia, digestive issues. And now that I've gone through kind of like this first wave of detoxification, a lot of that stuff is a ton better now. But I'm actually dealing with a lot of breathing issues, lung issues. I ended up going to my doctor and getting an inhaler just to have on hand, because I was noticing even with like light, strenuous activity, but like my lungs will lock up, and it's not like, oh, I'm out of shape and I'm having a hard time breathing. It's like my lungs are literally like locking up like an asthma attack, which I had when I was a young kid. And my mom had told me, through this whole process, I've been having conversations with family members about mold and whatnot, because it's just like interesting. And I've just been through hell and back, I feel like, with my health over the last couple of years, kind of uncovering all of this. And I had, when I was younger, my mom mentioned that we did have black mold in the house growing up that we lived in. And I had, like, I remember as a kid when I was like 5, 6 years old, going to Hershey Medical Center out in Pennsylvania, where I'm from, because they thought that I had this new type of asthma and breathing issues. So I did all this breathing testing and had inhalers and all this stuff. And so now I'm dealing with all these breathing issues. And on my mold retest, Stachyboitries came back up. And it's like just crazy to think that, like, has that been in my body since I was a kid? And now it's, we're, binding and detoxing and flushing this out of my system, and it's moved back into my lungs. And so it's interesting to kind of experience, like I've worked with people as a practitioner on detoxification protocols and things like that, but it's interesting to experience it yourself, of how these toxins kind of move, in layers, and then through different systems of the body as you're pushing them out. And so being mindful and knowledgeable on how to support different organ systems as these different toxins and mycotoxins kind of shift through the systems and open up and clear, and you go through this process. I mean, it's very interesting. And definitely, waves of it being challenging. I think at the beginning, I was just in such a protective state of myself that I was intimidated to start detoxing. I didn't want to exacerbate any symptoms. I didn't want to feel worse than I already did. And so I think, initially jumping into the protocol and just trusting it and knowing that like my body's going to work through this, trusting my body. And like, honestly, I feel like I trust myself and my body way more than I ever have in my life before, after having gone through the first couple months of this protocol, because, we're taught in the holistic side of things that your body has this incredible innate intelligence. It knows how to heal. If you create the right environment, it will heal. And so like, it's one thing to logically know that, and it's a different thing to actually feel and experience that. So it's definitely been, a gift, I think, to some extent, to be experiencing that and have like kind of that closeness and that trust with my body. But yeah, the process has been challenging, for sure. But I mean, after 3 months, I feel like a new person. I'm like way more mentally clear. Bowel movements are normal. I haven't had an, panic attack in probably like 8 to 10 months now. There's a lot of different things that have shifted. Like I can trust my stomach again, no bowel, bile issues or anything like that. I mean, like the changes have been exponential, and there's still like, I feel like I'm kind of on this last little chunk of getting things out, but the progress has been monumental. But yeah, in terms of products and things that I've been using, definitely binders, sauna, dry brushing, castor oil packs. I've done coffee enemas a few times, but just for anyone listening to the webinar here, I think that those are, they can be intense. Like everything that we're talking about, I think is definitely absolutely something that you should be doing alongside a practitioner that's skilled in this work, because it's not an easy feat to detox mycotoxins. They fight back a little bit. So
yeah, no, and I would definitely recommend people to go to, the two biggest groups I have found are, and I've been a part of, is you have the ICI group, which is the letter I, SCAI.org, and then you have the iLads group. One is more of a West Coast ILADS I find is like more West Coast. ILADS is more East Coast. But both groups are very good in national groups with lots of different practitioners, as well as environmental specialists. So
Yeah.
have you like which groups have you talked to or communicated with? I know you talked to Jill, who's a great
Yeah.
fount of knowledge, and she's been doing mold for I don't know, like 15 years or so. I would think. I know like she like went through her own mold crisis a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah, Jill's been, someone that I look up to, and just, knee deep in her research and everything that she's done, her protocols and connecting with her. Dr. Jill Krista is also someone that I've been looking up to and reading into. There's also kind of like this whole new wave of younger practitioners that are getting into mold as well. And so I've been connecting with them more as colleagues than anything, but Dr. Jabon Moore, Emily Morrow, there's so many other people. And yeah, Kendra from the Holistic Mother. There's a lot of different people. Revive Health and Wellness. But yeah, I mean, a lot of what I've been learning too is from Cellcore Biosciences. So as a practitioner, you can get an account with Cellcore Biosciences, and they're kind of on the forefront of this new wave of binders and carbon technology, and using humic and fulvic acids in their products to allow binders to go systemic in the body. And they also use active carbons instead of spent carbons. So instead of like a activated charcoal or a bentonite clay, those are spent carbons. So they're binding, but they don't have like this broad reach of binding capacity. And they also kind of stay secluded to the digestive tract. So the Cellcore binders, I feel like, have been a game changer for me personally in dealing with mold and environmental toxins. So they have a product that's called Carboxy that is, they've done research on, and it pulls every mycotoxin. It binds to every mycotoxin in the body. And then they also have this other product called CT Spore that is a spore-based probiotic that also has the humic fulvic acid and carbon technology kind of mixed into it. And so what they found was that they were able to flush out every single type of mold with Carboxy with this binder, but there was a few clients that they had that they were just like hitting walls with the last little bit of mold that they couldn't flush out. But in combining that CT Spore and getting those spore-based probiotics and those microbes in the gut, they were able to fully flush everything out. So I've learned a lot from those doctors. They have eco conferences twice a year. So they just had one in April in Florida. They've got another one coming up in October, I believe, in Illinois. So I've learned a lot from those seminars, and as a practitioner, when you get an account with them, they have this whole back end of like a learning center, an education center, just like an unbelievable amount of resources there. So that's where I've been doing a lot of my learning on mycotoxins, and then chatting with you guys and just kind of, expanding my network of other practitioners and doctors that are familiar with this work and have done it and have successful ways of addressing things. Dr. Neil Nathan is also another person that I've been just immersing myself in his research and information. So he has the book called Toxic that's all about, mold illness, Lyme, co-infections, mast cell activation syndrome, all sorts of different things. And he's also got a great website with information and mentorship groups and, all sorts of things. So I've just been like fully in the rabbit hole.
You dove straight in.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's great. That's why I've a lot. That's the story I've heard so many times from so many different practitioners of like they themselves have been exposed to mold. Yeah. They dove straight in, fixed themselves, and now they're on the like mission of like helping other people. Because I can't tell you how many people that I did consults with who were like suffering for like 4 or 5 years through some kind of chronic illness. Yeah. And then after we like figured out it was mold, 6 months, maybe a year later, almost completely better. So yeah. You were talking about the detox there and how it's like different like layers and kind of like peeling back an onion. And one thing I've like talked to when I'm consulting with practitioners and clients, they ask how quickly will the toxins come out. And I say, well, there's three different things that you have to like deal with: the genetics of the person, the environment of the person, and their diet. And it could range anywhere from like 3 months to a year and a half, depending on those three things. I mean,
Yeah.
unfortunately, I've treated lots of people that aren't able to like leave their moldy home or
Yeah.
afford to like even fix it. And that's, I mean, those are the hardest people to get all the toxins out.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've heard a lot of doctors say, and like colleagues of mine, that like unless you can get out of your moldy environment, like we can only do so much. And I mean, that's, it makes sense. You're really just kind of scratching the surface. If you're constantly being exposed to this toxic environment, like you can only support your body to a certain extent, and then you're just kind of trying to keep up with like toxic load versus exposure, which is just a cat and mouse game. So it is, one of those challenging things that, I know you believe this too, but if you can, like, just, get out of the environment that you're in,
Yeah.
or remediate to the best of your ability, or work with someone like you guys, which, I mean, we feel so much better being in our house, and it's like such a gift to have that and not feel like terrible every time we're in here, like notice symptoms get worse immediately when we walk in the door. And,
Yeah.
there's so many different pieces to how the environment plays a role. I mean, not just with mold, but in general, but with mold especially, it's like, yikes, you're really not going to heal to the best of your ability if you're still in that moldy environment, unfortunately.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the mold, like you, I mean, as I'm talking more to our audience than for you, mold
Yeah.
is releasing those mycotoxins, which don't degrade by heat or by most, I mean, unless you're using like a stringent chemical, you're not going to like degrade them. So, and then for like a lot of people, a lot of our clients that are dealing with mold, they've like formed SIRS, so they're very like chemically sensitive. So if you use some type of like stringent cleaner to degrade the mycotoxins, you're gonna trade one problem for another. So that's the reason why we use our natural enzymes to degrade the mycotoxins, which solves the no VOCs, but also like it's like different than those other companies that you're mentioning that will come in, tear everything out, but they
Yeah.
also are pretty much like spreading mycotoxins throughout the whole home, possibly, like you said, sometimes leading to more problems than you initially had.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've heard some horror stories of people that are like, yeah, we remediated, or people that try to DIY their projects. Like I have a client right now that is a firefighter. So he's been exposed to like just a ton of different toxins, and also found black mold in his own home and remediated it himself. And we're waiting on his mycotoxin tests to come back and some of his other like total toxic burden to come back. So we're just getting started with him. But it's like, geez, yeah, I mean, like we're constantly exposed to toxins in our day-to-day life. It's just the modern environment that we live in. But especially when it comes to mold, like I think people are completely unaware of it. They're unaware of how toxic it can be, how detrimental it can be, and how dangerous it can be for a lot of people. And that, like, you don't want to just go up and touch it or remediate it yourself or just be in that environment. And, it's a little deceiving because you can't see these mycotoxins. They're so small. They're, like many, many, many tiny little
It's like
microbes.
air. I mean, they're not much larger molecular than air, and you can't see air. So,
Yeah, it's crazy. So it's definitely, it's a challenging thing, I think, for a lot of people to kind of get their heads around unless they've experienced it.
yeah.
But yeah, always a journey. And I'm just grateful to have learned more and more about it. And, even in 3-4 months, like I feel so much better. I mean, there's times where I was just like, oh my God, like I got to figure this out. Like I cannot keep feeling this way and living this way. And like just knowing, for anyone who's listening, like knowing how you used to feel. One thing that I used to always tell myself was like, I didn't always feel this way and I'm not always going to feel this way.
Yeah, that's very true.
Just clearly some sort of challenging issue. It's not in my head. I think that's like the other challenging thing with mold is you're like, you can't see it, they're so small. It's like air, like we just mentioned. And it's kind of like what this like dark little dusty thing that's just in our crawl space is creating all of these crazy symptoms. And like, hell yeah, it definitely is. But it's, unless you're experiencing it or digging into it and learning about it, it does, I think for some people seem kind of like this foreign concept of like, oh, it's not that bad, or, I had a lot of people say like, oh, well, it's, not all molds are bad. It's just black mold. And if it's not black mold, then you're fine. You can have any other kind of mold as long as it's not black.
Yeah,
Which was
no.
like, no, that's not how this works.
I guess like one final thing I wanted to like talk about, you probably have like experience or talked to other clients that this is that like talked about the genetics of people and how like I like kind of consulted with a lot of families where one member of the family, either the husband or the wife, is having symptoms while the other one isn't. And that happens a lot because one person detoxes a lot better than the other. So you kind of have like a canary in the coal mine,
Yeah.
like with one of the two family members. But then that can like lead the one member that's having the symptoms feel like a little bit like, are they going crazy type thing, because they're like, well, I'm super sick, but my spouse or partner is not sick. What does that? I mean, what does that mean? So, but I
Yeah.
assume that you've talked to lots of people with those similar stories.
Yeah. We've got two sets of couples that are clients right now, dealing with mold, dealing with different issues, and everything that you just described is like exactly what these two separate couples are kind of going through. One person is dealing with it worse than the other. And my husband and I experienced this too. And, my husband grew up in like a very holistic minded family. And my mother-in-law, had gone through different health challenges growing up. And so they had been gluten-free since my husband was 16. Like before gluten-free was even a thing, they had
Yeah.
done 23andMe before 23andMe was, bought out by the FDA. So it used to have all this like unbelievable information in there about medicine and risk and genes and all this stuff that was amazing. And so my husband's been unbelievably supportive in my own journey with this. And I mean, for just to speak from personal experience, like I have had way more neurological symptoms than he has. He ended up having like headaches, migraines, and like a dry cough. But like no crazy digestive issues, no crazy, neurological mood and energy issues or anything like that. And so for a while it was just like, what is happening to me, like what's going on? And I've been in this field for a while, and so I knew like my gut instincts were like, something's driving this. And I had gone down the rabbit hole of methylation mutations and detoxification pathways. And I do have some methylation mutations, don't have MTHFR, but I do have them on COMT and a handful of others. So in my mind, the way that I've kind of understood everything, and we talked about this on my podcast when I interviewed you, about how genetics and methylation mutations can potentially determine how you may or may not process these mycotoxins and how they might affect you. And so in my mind, the way that I've experienced these mycotoxins is that they have absolutely triggered all of my methylation pathways and my genes, and by removing them, getting rid of them, and kind of re-regulating my limbic system and nervous system, like I barely deal with any of those symptoms anymore. So the saying of your genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. Like I definitely, absolutely have always believed that, but again, kind of crazy to experience it, and really nice to just get rid of these mycotoxins over time and see that shift. But I've also heard that women are more predisposed to mycotoxicosis and illness because we naturally have more fat cells in our bodies for reproductive purposes, and hormone balance and many other purposes. Like we just have a higher body fat percentage than men do from a primal standpoint. And since mold is lipophilic, it loves fat, like we're kind of a good target. And there's other things too, like lower testosterone levels. Testosterone seems to be somewhat protective from mycotoxins as well in men. Like I've seen some studies on that. And there's a lot of interesting aspects, but like the HLA-DR gene as well, determining how, whether or not you do process or do not process mycotoxins effectively. Like, there's so many other markers that kind of come into play that, there's definitely variance, even within the same people living in the same house, of how they're going to experience, mycotoxins being in the home. So like, I definitely have been the canary in the coal mine in my house. But grateful that there's love and understanding. But I've definitely had some clients where they're like, help me, please. No one believes me. My whole family, my ass, like just not a good experience. So if anyone's listening and is feeling that way, we believe you. It's very real.
Yeah,
We've seen
it's a real thing.
research to back it up. So
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I've talked to so many women, but you're right. It's very often women where like they just need somebody to believe in them, and it's like, yep, no, this is a thing. One other thing I wanted to cover, if you still have time.
yeah.
Okay, you talked about your like food sensitivities. Have you like done like different like time points of your food sensitivities? One thing I've like noticed through my research is that people like when they first get exposed to mycotoxins, their food sensitivities go up, but after we get rid of them, they start going down again. Have you noticed anything like that, or have you done enough testing to see something like that?
Yeah, great question. And I've heard the exact same thing. So I'm actually kind of holding out for 3 more months before I retest food sensitivities. So I did them at the beginning of this year in January and did the MRT food sensitivity test, and they were through the roof. I mean, of course, because mycotoxins, toxins in general are going to wreak havoc on the natural ecosystem of the gut, create space for leaky gut permeability, and you're going to have food sensitivities. This is what I tell a lot of my clients,
Yeah.
because I think in the nutrition space, especially, people get really hot on the topic of like, oh, we'll just do a food sensitivity test and then take those foods out and everything will be fine. And the reality is that it's not actually a food issue. It's usually a toxin and a digestive functionality issue. It's not like you ate too many carrots and now they're wreaking havoc and giving you headaches. So
Yeah.
That's not the problem. The problem is functionality of the GI tract, massive imbalance of the microbes, and a toxicity issue at the root of it. And so in terms of retesting, I haven't retested myself yet, but we have a lot of clients that are kind of in the beginning phases, and like we do GI map, MRT, mycotoxin, and it's like everything's off the chart. So the only thing on myself personally that I've retested at this point is the mycotoxin urine test. And again, ochratoxin's lowered, citrinin is lower. Some other ones are higher, and then stachybotrys, which I didn't even have before, is elevated. And
that's not surprising.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I've seen thousands of those. So,
yeah.
And I've worked with some practitioners that have done like testing like every like 2 weeks. So some very like nice I can have been able in the past to produce some very nice curves over excretion rates. But yeah, I mean, what you're explaining is what I have seen is like ochratoxin, aflatoxin A, especially citrinin, very a lot less lipophilic, but then like Stacky, it produces tricose, so like inositol A, inositol A is the one that comes to mind. But there's a couple other ones that are tricose. They're very lipophilic. They come out much later.
Yeah, they're stubborn for sure. The other thing too, so Cellcore, a lot of what I've learned from them is the benefit of parasite cleansing along with addressing mold and mycotoxins, because parasites can harbor mycotoxins, mold spores, and all sorts of different things, and heavy metals and different toxins. And so their suggested, process of elimination and just plan of action in addressing all these things is to open up and support the drainage detoxification pathways first to make sure that things are processing well so that you don't have Herxheimer detox reactions, and then address parasites and kind of hit the gut a little bit, before you jump into hitting mycotoxins. And so that has been the route that I've personally taken. It's the route that I also take with clients. And it's been really interesting to see. I almost feel like I'm like binding and flushing out mycotoxins faster than I expected after hitting parasites. And I was in Bangladesh, like I mentioned. I got really sick while I was there. All of my gut issues kind of went haywire after Bangladesh, and then mold exposures and everything just kind of like dominoes started falling. And I grew up working on horse farms in Pennsylvania and barefoot all the time. And, I'm like poster child for having parasites, so I ended up passing a lot of parasites over a 2-month period before hitting mycotoxins really hard. And I almost feel like a lot of the emotional heaviness was lifted after addressing parasites and then, hitting mold and using binders and things like that along the way. So it's not, I feel like the way in describing this, it's kind of like, seems like these really clean lines of boxes in different phases, but the reality is like a lot of these products kind of overlap into different phases of the protocol anyway. So to say like, oh, I just worked on drainage and then I just worked on parasites and now I'm just working on mold, it's not that segregated.
No.
Very much overlapping. And, these binders that I've been using since day one to help and support, toxins that parasites release, like that was also binding to mycotoxins. And so, the process has been, overlapped, but yeah, I mean, I have been more so targeting parasites and drainage pathways in the first 2 to 3 months. And now it's like, we're really getting into like deeper detoxification, cellular support, hitting that carboxy and those more intense binders along the way and really pulling out the mold. Because my body can handle it now, where I don't really think that I would have been able to right from the beginning. Like I think if I just like jumped on carboxy right from the start, I think I would have felt way worse if I would have, supported drainage, addressed parasites and moved on from there. So I will say that's like the only other thing from a practitioner perspective that I've personally experienced and then seen with clients, that like hitting parasites has been beneficial for a lot of people. Not everybody has a parasitic infection per se, but I do think, everyone's got parasites to an extent. It's just the environment that we live in. We get them from everywhere, whether it's symbiotic or like some sort of antagonistic relationship.
Well, especially since like mycotoxins lower the immune system. They lower the beneficial immune system, but unfortunately raise the inflammation parts of the immune system. So no, you're completely right on that.
Yeah, well, a journey.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us. We are so happy that we can like support you through your own personal like treatment here. Hopefully, I personally will get to like meet you at one of the like we're getting out of the COVID now, and hopefully I run into you at one of the upcoming like functional medicine events.
Yeah,
I know I'm going to be going to ILADS and A4M this year, and then I'll go to ICI and IFM next year. So
awesome. We'll have to link up at one of those. That'd be awesome.
Oh yeah. Well, thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time. Jill Christo will be will be our guest next month. So we'll be looking forward to talking to Jill. Jill's been a friend of mine for about 5 years, so I'm really happy to have her on the webinar.
Awesome.
Okay. Thanks, Caitlin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for all of your encouragement, support, knowledge, and expertise. I mean, you guys have been like Remediation Company of the Year award. Sure, like you guys just have so many supports and knowledge and information, and like you've been an amazing resource to connect with along the process. So if anyone's, questioning who they should work with, I mean, I can't recommend you guys highly enough. You've been unbelievably supportive and just along every step of the way in every possible aspect that I feel like we have needed support on, with remediation, with questions, with personal health, with my practice. You guys have been unbelievable. So thank you. And thanks for having me on.
No problem. I'll talk to you later. Bye, everybody.